Hi, this is Dr. Vicente, and for this lecture, I will be talking about values education and perspectives in geography. The main question that I will be exploring in this lecture is what you see here on the screen. How can I promote critical reflective practice amongst young learners? In doing that, I will quickly review critical reflective practice and teacher efficacy. These were two main points that I spoke of in the introductory lecture. And then I'm going to go to an example of how I can actually, as a teacher, promote critical reflective practice amongst young learners, otherwise known as lifelong learning, by using geography and values education. In the introductory lecture, I spoke about the landmark book of Donald John in relation to the idea of reflective practitioners. If you recall, as teachers, I think one of our roles is to really awaken the interests and the desire of our learners to know about themselves, to know about nature, to know about the world they live in. And one way to do that is to try to make them become reflective practitioners. If you remember, I spoke about reflection in action, um, which can be referred to as surprise by introducing new knowledge to learners. I also talked about reflection on action, and that's when, after a particular activity, teachers, together with learners, talk about and reflect about what just happened and see lessons learned, things that can be improved in relation to the learning activity. And of course, what we're really after is the idea of critical reflective practice. Essentially, that means continually learning even after the classrooms have closed or even after the school has ended. That's what we want our young learners to achieve. In order to make that happen, another main point that I spoke about in our introductory lecture is the idea of teacher efficacy. If you remember, in that introductory lecture, I asked several questions, and based on a survey that we conducted, we essentially discovered that teacher efficacy is the biggest predictor of how teachers saw themselves perform well in the classroom. And teacher efficacy is actually a notion that we are borrowing from a good friend of mine, Megan Shannon Moran. And when she talks about teacher efficacy, she looks at three notions: instructional strategies, classroom management, and student engagement. So, for this particular lecture, we are going to try to become efficacious teachers with the desire of fostering critical reflective practice among young learners. And we're going to use the subject of geography as our platform and then incorporate that with values education. So this graphic that you see is a matrix that describes the year levels, key inquiry questions, key concepts, and content descriptions. You should already be familiar with this, especially if you've started undertaking your homework, your assignment one, I mean. And for most of you, you should already be midway and almost finishing up with your assignment one for this particular unit. So that's the what I just showed you was the matrix of the geography inquiry questions and content descriptions from for the primary school levels. This graphic that you see in front of you essentially would be the continuum of values education. So we have from the left-hand side values inculcation, and then on the right-hand side action learning. So the continuum essentially describes direct examination of students' own values and commitment to act, as you can see right here in this text in the center. On this side, direct examination of students' own values and commitment to act is not expected, but on this other end, these are expected. So we have values inculcation, moving towards values analysis, moral reasoning, values clarification, and action learning. So I'll briefly talk about each of these values approaches, and then I'll focus on what I, based on my experience, would call as the most complex but also most rewarding values process, and that is action learning. Let's take a look at values inculcation. In your topic notes, what we have made as a claim is that values inculcation can actually be compared to indoctrination. So here, as mentioned earlier, there really is no place for the young learners to reflect and validate the kinds of values they have or to even act, because it's essentially um, a didactic approach, inculcating values that teachers believe will benefit kids, young learners. In the topic notes, you will read that there are different opinions regarding this. Some people believe that uh, inculcation should not really be practiced. Some believe that there's another way to approach it. But as teachers, we should be familiar with these. These are tools, these are techniques that we should be familiar with. Again, if we are efficacious, when we take a look at our classroom, the kinds of students we have, we can then decide which particular approach is most appropriate. The next approach that I'll briefly be talking about is values analysis. In values analysis, essentially what happens is that the young learners are exposed to different points of view, right, in relation to a particular set of values, right? So that means collecting newspaper articles, perhaps watching some videos, interviewing individuals, or inviting resource speakers to talk about their positions in relation to a particular value-laden issue. Right? So this particular approach moves beyond the mere inculcation into more analytical perspectives. Right? So this is another approach that can be used when we talk about imparting values. Moral reasoning is essentially the third point in the continuum when you talk about values approaches. And in moral reasoning, what happens here is that we essentially expose young learners to diverse, very different perspectives in relation to values, and in so doing, present them with issues, right? And when issues are presented, when a problem or a situation is presented, we can then take a look at solutions to these problems from different perspectives. It's somehow similar to values analysis, but the difference here is that there really is a problem that needs to be addressed. For values analysis, it's not necessary to have an issue that needs to be analyzed, to be broken down, but in moral reasoning, that is very important. Now, this particular book by Carol Gilligan is a seminal piece. It's a landmark book that looks at different voices of individuals in relation to moral issues. Carol Gilligan is actually a disciple of Kohlberg, who talks about the moral stages of learning. The difference in this book that she has written is that she actually incorporates the voices of different people, particularly their gender, in relation to issues related to healthcare, issues related to self-harm, suicide. It's an interesting book. It's a seminal piece of work. It's one of the books that reshaped the way that scholars and practitioners looked at solving moral dilemmas, particularly by listening to the voices of individuals affected by these issues. The fourth point in the continuum is values clarification. In the values clarification here, what happens is that the young learners are actually forced to reflect and take a look at their values as opposed to other people's values and try to see differences and perhaps even make a justification as to why the young learners subscribe to a set of values. This is much more complex because here there will be, as expected, there will be some friction, some debate, but handled by an efficacious teacher, it becomes a truly learning experience. This particular book, Man's Search for Meaning, one of the books that I read while I was growing up as a secondary student, is is actually a very good example of how an individual, in this case Viktor Frankl, is able to clarify his values. In a nutshell, this is the story of how Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz. He was a prisoner in the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, and of course, the biggest dilemma then was how do you survive from day to day? And in the story, in the book, he talks about how he would take daily walks with his wife every day that he was in the concentration camp. Of course, his wife was not with him. He was essentially visualizing, imagining what he was talking about. Really, what he was acting upon was hope, the value of hope, as opposed to the desperation that surrounded him in the concentration camp. It's an example of how values clarification can actually be analyzed, studied, and reflected upon. Now we go to action learning, which is what I really wanted to focus on in this particular lecture. So for action learning, what is important here is that the young learners are not just merely solving problems in the confines of the classroom. They actually need to go out and participate in community activities. Based on my experience reading assignments related to values approaches, mistakes are made by by students, pre-service teachers, for example, in interpreting action learning as mere problem solving. When we're talking about just mere problem solving, it can actually fall under values clarification or even values analysis or moral reasoning even, right? The main difference in action learning is that the students actually go out and participate and engage with their community. If that component is not part of a particular unit of work, a particular in-class activity, then it cannot be called action learning. Let's take a look at the geography matrix again. And for this particular example, I'm going to focus on year 6. The year level focus is a diverse and connected world. And I'm going to take a look at the third inquiry question that you find in this matrix. How do people's connections to places affect their perception of them? So I'm going to take a look at how individuals and their connections with specific locations affect how they perceive these locations. And I'm going to take a look at major countries of the Asian region in relation to Australia and the geographical diversity within that particular region. In order to highlight the idea of looking at another region, I will be focusing on Singapore. And here I have chosen as stimulus material. This is essentially a newspaper article that talks about this location in the eastern side of Singapore, which is called Mandai Mudflats. And the headline talks about calls to save Mandai site that is rich in biodiversity. When I was still based at the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, I was actually an active member of the Nature Society of Singapore. And I used to bring my students to this particular site. That's my experience in action learning. So I was doing this for like 7 years while I was still there in Singapore. It's a very rich, very diverse mangrove site located in, as I said, the eastern part of Singapore. So I'm going to use this as a stimulus material. And the key inquiry question that I'm going to look at as I select from the curriculum is the one that you see on that screen. How do people's connections to places affect their perception of them? And then I'm going to try to match my stimulus material with the inquiry question and the values approach. I'm going to be undertaking action learning, and I'm going to try to make this particular activity coherent. So I will prepare contributing questions. And this is the first one. How do people affect living fossils that inhabit coastal areas? So the Mandai mudflats, that mangrove in Singapore, is actually, of course, a coastal area. So one thing that I can do, and I'm adopting here some elements of the cognitive inquiry sequence, which you will learn as you continue through this particular unit, right? So when we talk about that, I look at what the teacher needs to do and also what the students need to think. So as the teacher, I will arouse curiosity about the topic. I establish the context. I check for and use prior knowledge. How do the learners rate in terms of knowledge of what coastal areas are? And then I introduce the question and determine with students how they might find the information needed to answer the question. So that's the get interest stage. For the students, what they need to carefully think about is, what do I already know about this topic? What further information would I like to know? How can I find out this information? So this is the reflective practice elements that I'd like to foster among the students to carefully think about it. Again, it falls under the cognitive inquiry sequence component of getting interested. And then I try to clinch or try to attract their attention even more by talking about horseshoe crabs, right? And so I point out to them that in this particular location, this is a picture of the mudflats. This is the island of Singapore. It's located up here, northwestern side. I was saying east, just north or northeastern side, right? And then I will show an image of a tiny horseshoe crab and several big horseshoe crabs. So this is something that not many students are familiar with. So what are horseshoe crabs? Where do I find them? So as a teacher, I move on to the find out component of the cognitive inquiry sequence. And my role would be to ensure that students have access to adequate resources. That means I have prepared materials. It could be in newspaper clippings, it could be short videos, it could even be realia, live examples of horseshoe crabs. And then I use questioning to assist students to evaluate the reliability and balance of the information that I provided to them. That's important in the finding out stage. Again, we want them to be critical reflective practitioners. So we want students to select data to answer the question that I have posted them, the contributing question. Then I would like them to evaluate the data for richness, reliability, and relevance. I like them to be critical, to have a healthy skepticism. And then they start grouping the facts that they collect. I move on to the sorting information stage. So this is the mud flats, and those buildings are actually another country. That's Malaysia, and that's the Straits of Malacca. And that's me with my student, where we were trying to rescue horseshoe crabs. The uniqueness of this particular coastal portion of Singapore is that it has the highest concentration of horseshoe crabs, one of the highest concentrations of horseshoe crabs in the world, right? And unfortunately, because of the polluted area of this coastal location, horseshoe crabs get trapped in nets, in rubbish. So on a monthly basis, I, together with volunteers, we go to this location and we conduct Operation Horseshoe Crab. We try to rescue them from from the kinds of the problems that they encounter. So at this stage, I will be using, I have this other contributing question: why do horseshoe crabs live in our polluted coastal areas, right? Because this is something that we have discovered. That horseshoe crabs seem to, well, at least in the Singapore context, you find a huge concentration of them in the really polluted areas like this one. So in this stage, the students are in the third component of the cognitive inquiry sequence, and they're sorting information. So as a teacher, I need to use questioning or activities to assist students to see relationships and concepts, and thus form generalizations about the data that they collect. I also guide students to display data in a usable form, such as a table or other graphic organizers. This is the skill of sorting information. So for the students, they need to be able to process data. Again, it's this lifelong learning skill that they will be able to use not only during the primary school years, but later on when they grow old as adults. And then the data can be displayed in a succinct, visual, and concrete way. Then I move on to answering the question, right? So how do people affect living fossils that inhabit coastal areas? This was the main contributing question that I had. And these are the answers that they should be able to come up with. We threaten their habitats. We continue to destroy them. What we do in other parts of their environment can make them flourish or diminish. So that's the answering the question stage of the cognitive inquiry sequence. Teacher needs to guide a discussion that allows students to justify their answer and thus build on group understanding. The teacher provides and may scaffold. Ideally, we follow Bruner's notion of scaffolding. Scaffolding opportunity for students to explain and communicate their answer. For the students, they need to be able to form generalizations. Remember, the context that I have here is that they're year 6, right? And that's also important. In your assignments, you need to specify what key stage you're looking at, and even better, try to identify the year or age group that you're looking at. So I want the students to be able to form generalizations about the data, and justify these, and develop skills to explain and communicate their answers. An important component of becoming critical reflective practitioners is to make connections. So this is the horseshoe crab rescue and research program that we have. So I do this with my pre-service teachers. I used to do this with my pre-service teachers. And what they do then is they bring their young learners to these communities. So these are primary school kids that do exactly the same thing that the pre-service educators did. And then we make connections. We take a look at the main contributing question again: how do people affect living fossils that inhabit coastal areas? Teacher needs to assist students to see the purpose and relevance of what has been learned. Provide new resources for further investigation of issues, topics, perspectives. Assist students to decide if action is needed or appropriate. Right? So that's the role of the pre-service teacher. And then the students need to decide, how does this affect me? This is making connection, making it relevant. Do I need to know more? What are the consequences of this event issue today? Is further action needed, appropriate? So making connections is absolutely important. Just as an aside, this particular area in Singapore, the Mandai Mudflats, is actually in great, is threatened. That stimulus material that I showed you, if you actually read it more carefully, what has happened is that that particular location has been declared as a site that will be further developed by the Singapore government. They will develop it to make it into a tourist site. So they were going to create really fancy decorations of the place, maybe create a walking area. Nice and good, it will foster tourism, but I and my friends at the Nature Society of Singapore say that if we do that, we will effectively kill off, destroy the population of horseshoe crabs, because we will remove their main source of habitat, make it cleaner, make it more attractive, earn dollars, but lose one of the highest concentrations of horseshoe crabs in the world. That's the issue there that is really relevant, and that's when the pre-service teachers are able to use this and to connect it to the young learners to say, what happens to your future? Will you still be able to see horseshoe crabs? Interestingly, when we did this research and we looked at when we did this action learning, we part of the action learning component was to interview people around the community and talk to them about um, what their experience was with horseshoe crabs. And when we did this nationwide, because we would do a census of all the horseshoe crabs island wide, not just the Manday mudflats, we discovered that 30, 40 years ago, when we talked to the older generation, they remember times when there were so many horseshoe crabs that you could find in the beach, but now you don't see that anymore. And they just seem to be concentrated on those highly polluted areas like the Manday mudflats, because there's not too many people who go there because it's dirty, it's filthy. And they say that if the current pace of development happens, they fear, which is a justifiable fear on their part, that we may no longer see horseshoe crabs in that part of the world. And then we go to, uh, which brings us to the final point of this cognitive inquiry sequence, which is evaluate. What is the current situation of horseshoe crabs today? How are their habitats? How do they survive? What contribution do they make to humanity? So these images are that you see here are actually my pre-service teachers when I brought them to several of these sessions. What we did was we integrated science, history, geography, of course, in these activities. We It was very difficult to find out the population density of horseshoe crabs. So what we would do is we would divide up the shoreline into transects, and we would collect horseshoe crabs and we would mark them, right? Uh, Initially, we were using nail polish, but later on, we became much more sophisticated. We started using tracking devices. But in this case, we were able to, I mean, if on week one we collect something like 100 horseshoe crabs in a particular 1 meter by 1 meter transect, the next week, we'll take a look at it. If we collect the same number of crabs, if the marks are still there, then that means that the population is not too big. But if we collect new crabs and there are no marks and we mark them, that means that we're really looking at the big population. So we were doing population densities. So these are the students marking the crabs. We were also checking the gender of the crabs and measuring the sizes. We also checked the salinity of the coastal water. And some of the pre-service teachers would interview, as I said, the members of the community and find out how they related, what interactions they had with the horseshoe crabs. You might be surprised to hear that some of the folk who live around the area actually believe that horseshoe crabs have an aphrodisiac effect. I will let you think about what they would do to horseshoe crabs in order to gain those effects. But the main medical contribution of horseshoe crabs, and this is proven already, is that when you mix the horseshoe crab's blood with toxic material, there is a marked change in the color of the substance. So actually, it can be used, the blood of the horseshoe crab can be used to detect toxicity levels, to detect poison. So for this particular sequence, the evaluate sequence, the teacher needs to use questioning to help students determine what was learned. This is actually metacognition, what was learned, and to evaluate the learning process. Metacognition is essentially learning how you learn or reflecting on how you actually accumulated knowledge and skills. Students need to reflect on what have I learned, how have I learned this, how will I use this knowledge and skills, and where do I go from here, right? I'm glad to note that we did this particular activity. We were doing this action learning activities some 7 years ago, and these pre-service teachers who are now full-fledged teachers still communicate with me and tell me the very positive news that they actually, quite a number of them have continued volunteering their time, their resources to help the Nature Society of Singapore, and they've actually incorporated that into their classes. I think that's the best indication that somehow action learning has made an impact on the lives of these young teachers, and then imparting this knowledge to learners. In the Moodle site, I've uploaded this 16-minute video that talks about the this learning activity that I initiated together with my students. So you can see this particular video in the Moodle site. You have my email address. We have a forum, so if you have any questions about this particular lecture on values education and perspectives in geography, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. Thank you.